Thank you. Okay, got it. Um, there. Thank you, Anne, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. And likewise, thanks to Jeff Church for his leadership originally in putting this thing together and his ongoing help in sustaining it. This is one of the outgrowths, I guess, of the pandemic that I'm kind of hoping hangs around a good while beyond the point at which the pandemic itself is consigned to the history books. Well, Anne gave me license to use a little more than the 10 minutes that Jeff had recommended to introduce my my piece and my topic. I hope, Anne, that doesn't turn out to be a mistake. But I'm going to talk here for a little bit and then entertain your comments and questions. My interest in this conversation between Socrates and Crito springs in the first instance from a broader preoccupation with the question of the noble. And the lens that I employ for bringing this particular conversation into focus has been, I have to confess, shaped to a notable extent by Nietzsche's early work on Greek culture, and in particular, what Nietzsche represents, especially in The Birth of Tragedy, as the cataclysmic confrontation between Socrates and the pre-Socratic moral world erected by the poets. Within notable parameters, and maybe at some point it will be make sense to spell out some of those parameters, I follow Nietzsche in viewing what might be termed the popular morality of the 5th century Athens in particular, as arising in large part out of what might, out of a moral aesthetic formation supplied by the poets, which rooted itself in the sentiments and sensibilities of its subjects. On my account then, this dialogue conveys a confrontation between the sentimental, or I also like this language that you find among British writers on this business, a motivist moral outlook of the tradition, personified in this case by Crito, and Socrates, who claims to seek always what he describes as the best logos in arriving at grounds for right action. At the center of this confrontation stands the question of how a genuinely just and noble and good man should navigate the urgent circumstances facing these two men. To follow the course of this conversation, I argue it's necessary to keep always in view its governing imperative of arriving at a shared understanding and agreement concerning what is to be done. That is, of course, the famous subtitle of this dialogue. Similarly, a full assessment of the arguments by which Crito is brought ultimately to embrace a course of action to which I think Socrates seems previously committed demands that we keep well in view Plato's account of the defense speech that Socrates has recently made in the Apology. So just to outline then my reading, my explication of the dialogue as an account of how Socrates uses Crito and Crito's traditional, what I've called moral aesthetic commitments in doing what's honorable, and avoiding what's shameful, to bring him ultimately into agreement with his Socrates' own prior decision to accept the death sentence decreed by the court and the city. And I divide my explication into kind of 7 parts, and I'll just touch on each of them. The first one is the setting of the stage, the so-called prologos of the dialogue. As the dialogue opens, Crito notes how his own condition, vexed by, as he describes it, sleeplessness and pain, contrasts with that of Socrates, who he describes as in an easy and mild way confronting his misfortunes. In response, Socrates asserts that it would be discordant. He uses a Greek word here that could likewise be translated as out of tune, for him to comport himself otherwise, implying that he is, in effect, in tune, in a state of harmony with himself as he faces the end of his life. Introducing Socrates here as the personification of well-tuned equanimity recalls, I think, the heroic portrait that Plato has previously painted of his mentor in the Apology. The next section, the second section of my explication, I entitled the Mantic Socrates. And in this section, I discussed the fact that Socrates represents himself, or sorry, not Socrates, Crito comes representing himself as the anchor leg in a relay of messengers, bringing the unhappy news of the tribute ship's imminent return. You'll recall that on the day Socrates was judged guilty and condemned to death, a tribute ship was launched, an annual ship, an annual tribute that the Athenians performed. The ship was launched and it sailed to Delos and performed certain rituals and then came back again. But no executions could be performed in the time that the ship was away. So there is a space of time, a kind of extra large space of time during which Socrates is simply hanging out in his prison cell, and Crito seems to have been a pretty frequent visitor during that time. Crito, on this occasion, has come to inform Socrates that the following day will be the date of his execution, given what he has learned about the tribute ship's imminent return. However, Socrates disputes this timetable, and he does so on the basis of a dream in which a figure reminiscent of Achilles' divine mother, Thetis, appeared to him to pronounce that on the third day he would arrive in fertile Phthia. In this way, Plato renews Socrates' self-identification with the greatest warrior hero of the Greeks, while at the same time further blurring the lines of demarcation by directly inserting the heroic Socrates into Homer's story of Shining Achilles. And maybe it's worth just quickly reviewing the passage that I'm alleging this event or this dream kind of picks up on in the Apology, where Socrates responds to an anonymous accusation or an anonymous question. Socrates uses this trope of introducing an anonymous question in 3 different places in the Apology and on through the Crito, to kind of steer the course of his discourse. And in this case, the anonymous question is, Socrates, aren't you ashamed that your life devoted to philosophizing has eventuated in this circumstance? And Socrates responds with what he describes as a just speech by in effect, that he is not ashamed of the fact that his life of philosophizing has led him to the present circumstance. And he does so at the same time by bringing Achilles on stage as his ally in the fight for what is just. He represents himself like Achilles as, in effect, a warrior for justice. Achilles is thereby recast as something of a selfless defender of the just, rather different from the way he's portrayed in Homer, where he seems moved to action primarily by his considerable anger, rage, or wrath. If you know the Iliad, you know that it begins with a famous description of Achilles as a man who has been moved by wrath or anger, menace not to simply stop participating in the battle and sit by his ship. By the same token, Socrates here represents himself as possessing the mantic powers of a clairvoyant or seer. The word mantic comes from a Greek word. The Greek word is mantis. And Crito, in his turn, is simply dismissive of Socrates' claims of mantic insight. He seems rather to suspect that Socrates is using this tale to forestall yet another conversation about Crito's plan to sneak him out of prison. This early episode highlights several things in my view. It illustrates, on the one hand, the fact that Socrates looks to be in search of an effective means, even one very different from the philosophic conversation that is, in some sense, his characteristic means of engaging with his interlocutors. In this case, a means of circumventing another attempt by Crito to argue for his plan of escape. And we learn in the course of the unfolding discourse that this isn't the first time these two have talked about this whole matter and talked about what seems to be Crito's well-laid plans to help him escape from his circumstance. It also illustrates, in my view, what follows by way of a conversation will be very different in kind from those more recognizably Socratic conversations that aim at what Socrates represented in the Apology as his Delphic calling to trace the limits of human wisdom. This conversation will be governed by the very practical aim of reaching agreement about what is to be done. Okay, sections 4 and 5 then of my explication concern the urgent concern that Crito wants to put to Socrates and his calling on Socrates, his admonition to Socrates to make the choice of a good and manly man. We learn that what most concerns Socrates is the likelihood that the many, the polloi, will view Socrates' death as evidence that Crito, a wealthy man, after all, regards money as more important than friends, and that this will redound to Crito's shame, a shame that would attach to what he considers to be a misperception. Through Crito, in other words, the desideratum of avoiding every appearance of acting shamefully gives a kind of formative shape to this conversation. From Socrates' response to Crito and his concern, however, I think we can unpack several especially important conclusions. Socrates credits his philosophizing, not Athens, for what he represents as his well-ordered soul. And by the same token, he does not ultimately understand himself as indebted to Athens for his, let's call it, moral constitution. These are both insights, I think, that become especially helpful and important in making sense of Socrates' arguments in the name of the nomoi, or the laws, at the end of the dialogue. Crito, nevertheless, makes a final attempt to shame Socrates into agreeing to his essentially extrajudicial plan for breaking him out of prison and setting him up in exile. He charges Socrates with committing injustice, first for betraying himself, second for aiding the injustice of his enemies, and third for abandoning his young sons. He then implores Socrates to choose what a good and manly man would choose. So, in sum, Crito draws squarely on the aesthetic and sentimental tradition of morality descended from the poets in an attempt to move Socrates with emphatic appeals to shame and honor to adopt his plan or proposal. By contrast, Socrates proposes a revisiting of arguments and conclusions that we are informed they've considered before, to consider again whether they look any different in the light of present circumstances. In short, to submit the question of how best to proceed once again to what we might describe as a lenkic adjudication. And true to form, Socrates contends for a rank ordering of opinion guided by a recognition of the right of rational knowledge or expertise to prevail. And he appeals, as he does elsewhere, including in the Apology, to the techni, the arts, as a kind of model of a rational body of knowledge. You may recall in the Apology, when Socrates gives his account of how he came to his vocation and describes his good friend Chaerephon's report from Delphi. He sets out, as he explains it, to essentially put to the test the pronouncement of the oracle, and he goes to three different groups: the politicians, the politikoi, the poets, and finally to the artisans or the masters of the different techni, And it's only the third group where he finds that they actually do have command of a kind of knowledge, that they do know something he doesn't know, insofar as they are masters of their respective techne. Okay, sections then 6 through 8 involve, these sections really are concern the point in the dialogue where Socrates takes charge of what transpires for the rest of the dialogue. And he does so in an interesting way by kind of reiterating Critos' guiding concern. And then, of course, the final section of the dialogue where he assumes the voice of the laws and articulates a number of arguments that finally win Critos' consent to letting things proceed as Socrates seems to have intended they should proceed all along. Suspecting that Crito, despite consistently affirming the conclusions put before him, remains unpersuaded, Socrates returns to Critos' original concern with the power of the many. And he says, on behalf of, again, another anonymous questioner or anonymous individual, but the fact is, someone might say, the many are able to kill us. A little anonymous interjection that Crito eagerly jumps on and agrees to, even though he's given us no indication in the course of Socrates' attempt to kind of lead him through a review of conclusions they had agreed to before, that he had any trouble with these conclusions in light of present circumstances. So Socrates' anonymous objection or interjection to the course of his own argument has a twofold function, as I see it. One, Socrates thereby confirms that Crito is not prepared to submit to the authority of the best logos, at least as Socrates understands that logos. And two, he therefore uses the menace of the many, who after all can mortally threaten us, as the anonymous interjection would indicate, to turn the tables on Crito, who has, of course, already called on Socrates to choose what a manly man would choose. So Socrates here expressly recalls the image of the heroic philosopher that he introduces in the Apology, the philosopher who, with manly Achilles, is resolutely committed to living nobly and justly, even if it risks his own destruction. In strategic rhetorical terms, you might say Socrates makes essentially the same move here that he did there in the Apology, where he was responding to, of course, another anonymous question that introduces the question of shame and honor. In this way, Socrates sets the stage for a final sequence of arguments directed primarily at Crito that constitute a response to the question of whether Crito's plan to defy the city's verdict amounts to a commission of an injustice, and as such, to a greater evil than acquiescing in the injustice of the city. Also noteworthy, it seems to me, is the fact that Socrates has now firmly connected up the question of the noble course to pursue with that of the just course. So it's my contention that the arguments that Socrates makes in the voice of the laws, in the voice of the nomoi, is guided by the imperative of bringing Crito round to accept once and for all the course to which Socrates has long since committed himself. In the voice of the law, Socrates can speak more compellingly to a certain moral, sentimental attachment that Crito feels for his city, while also making a case for understanding the noble, in this case, as best exhibited in defending the rule of the laws, and in putting one's own life on the line to secure their just rule. It's also my contention that the arguments that Socrates advances at this stage of the dialogue, though formally directed at himself and his own situation, apply less compellingly to his case than to that of Crito. This fact is perhaps best shown by examining the claim the nomoi make about their ownership or responsibility for Socrates as compared with Crito. I sum it up in a question. And the question is, how would the Socrates of the Apology respond to the argument of the nomoi that consigns him to the status of a slave in relation to the authority of the laws? And I argue that the answer to that question is, in effect, packed into his famous proclamation late in his formal defense speech, his apologia, that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Socrates thereby elevates the priority of a life devoted to philosophizing to an existential necessity, which recognizes at the same time a higher authority, vividly represented in the Apology, of course, by the God to whom he refers regularly, than that of the city, and to which Socrates owes his ultimate allegiance. Hence my conclusion. The contention here is not that Socrates speaks insincerely when he gives voice to the nomoi, nor that the arguments he offers against Critos' plan have no genuine valence for him, but that the case he makes on behalf of the city and its laws is incomplete and ultimately insufficient. Moreover, that case is directed primarily by the practical priority of finding a common ground from which he and Crito can respond in unison to the question of what is to be done. As such, Socrates uses the voice of the laws to speak to what are perhaps Critos' highest and most noble inclinations and sentiments. The dialogue, in effect, as I read it, presents us with a kind of twofold conception of the noble at the end of the day. On the one hand, the noble, it seems to me, is represented as defending the just rule of the laws, even with one's own life, if necessary. This is the argument, I think, that ultimately persuades Crito to abandon his plans for sneaking Socrates out of prison, his extrajudicial plan for resolving the situation. And I call this the civic understanding of the noble. But on the other hand, I think the noble there's also hints at least of the noble understood in terms of defending the priority of a life devoted to philosophizing, even with one's own life, if necessary. And I would describe this as the existential understanding of the noble. One of them you might describe or might characterize as a kind of exoteric teaching in the dialogue, and the other somewhat more esoteric. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you, Dwight, for that excellent presentation of your paper. And so what I'll do now is I'll moderate our discussion of Dwight's paper. And so if you could, I'll use the chat function. So if you have a question for Dwight or you'd like to make a comment, please just in the chat function say, I have a question, I have a comment, and I'll create a queue and come to you. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so questions, comments for Dwight? Michael.
Yeah, three short comments and then a big question. First, you say early in the dialogue that it begins before everybody else gets up, and that it's in the proioi, which is a period when almost everybody got up before dawn. So I think that that's just a little tiny factual thing that I would change. Secondly, you say that he compare him to Achilles, and in a certain sense, certainly in terms of courage, that's correct. But in terms of his goal, his Achilles' goal is not to help his friends. I mean, in fact, he blames himself for deserting his friends in interest of his own glory. So he's kind of anti-Achilles in that respect. Thirdly, and you mentioned Nietzsche at the beginning, for Nietzsche, the conclusion from Socrates' statement that the unexamined life is not worth living doesn't mean that the examined life is worth living. In fact, the examined life might not be worth living either, right? And there you can look at Twilight of the Idols, where in the Problem of Socrates, he says, Socrates basically commits suicide because life is painful. My bigger question really has to do with the purpose of the dialogue. And I teach, or of your paper, I teach a course on writing articles for my graduate students, and one of the questions, or two of the questions that we always ask are, first of all, what's the basic problem or question that your paper is meant to answer? And secondly, if you're right, who's wrong?
Okay, thanks. Well, I take your point, your first point about the hour. What is clear in the dialogue, I mean, what exactly the sleeping status of the rest of Athens is simply a guess. What is clear is that Crito arrives while Socrates is still asleep, and there is some emphasis placed on the fact that he's there very early because he can't sleep, but he doesn't want to interrupt what he perceives to be Socrates' very serene sleep. So there is a certain kind of issue that the dialogue itself makes about the earliness of Crito's arrival, the fact that Socrates, at least, is still very much asleep, and then, of course, the comparison between the two states that builds on that difference.
You might there look at the Protagoras in comparison to that, because in the Protagoras, somebody actually arrives at a really early hour, at 3:30 or so in the morning, in which Socrates remarks on.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, on the question of your second point, I'm tempted to talk about the difference between, let's call it Socrates' Achilles and Homer's. I think I kind of sketched out a note that I mean to supply eventually to that effect. I mean, I think that the Achilles, the account of Achilles, and so to speak, the portrait of Achilles that we get in the Apology is in a variety of ways quite different from Homer's Achilles. Not the least of which is the fact that Socrates' Achilles does seem to be committed first and last, as it were, to defending the just. And that's what Socrates represents as kind of his affinity with Achilles, or as the quality that he is emulating, that Achilles is also known for. So I think that I don't think we have a disagreement there. I just think it's necessary to make clear that Socrates has his own version, as at least presented in the Apology, of Achilles and his motives, quite different in the end. I mean, they represent a significant act of editing of Homer's portrait of Achilles, but it's that Achilles, in some sense, that he, I think, is inclined to cast his lot with and represent as his ally. And then, of course, as I said in my remarks and also in the paper, one of the things that happens in this dialogue in the Crito is that the line distinguishing Socrates from Achilles is blurred even further by the fact that here he kind of inserts himself or he tells a story about a dream that kind of inserts him in a narrative that is lifted really out of the pages of Homer concerning Achilles' life and his interactions with his mother. The final question about the purpose of my explication and the basic question. I guess the basic question is something like, what do we learn about Plato's negotiation of this idea, this concept, this key social, moral, political concept of the noble, and by extension, this category that is so important to the dialogue or to the moral discourse of this time, the kalos kagathos, the noble and good man, from this particular conversation. And it seems to me that's what's also novel about the explication, looking through that lens at this conversation, what it brings to light about what Plato's doing, and what we can kind of come to see, I think, by the end of it, concerning the different levels on which it's operating in relation to that idea. I think that Plato, like Xenophon, understood that Socrates from the outset was intent on kind of using the circumstance of his trial to try to do something that he ultimately saw as very noble for philosophy, and that I mean, as Xenophon presents it, Socrates had decided the question of what he was going to do in the trial and what verdict he was seeking in advance of the trial, and then he went out of his way to offend the jurors enough to ensure that he was not only guilty but got the harshest penalty. I think Plato understood that too. We see something, I think, in the kind of middle part of the Apology, the part where Socrates has been found guilty and he is responding to then the question of what penalty goes with this guilt. And it's really in that part that he employs what Xenophon characterizes, what Xenophon calls megalegoria, kind of big talk, that ensures that the only viable alternative as far as penalties go that's kind of on the table for the jurors is the one that the prosecution has put there, because Socrates' proposal of a penalty doesn't amount to a real penalty, at least in the first instance, and does seem to have the effect of ultimately offending more jurors than his initial defense speech did. So in any event, I think that as I say, that my interest in both of these dialogues is kind of drawn or activated by the extent to which they have a very practical political set of concerns. I think that's one of the reasons why maybe the Crito is a somewhat neglected dialogue, it seems to me. I mean, there's not really a lot of secondary literature on the Crito. I think when you take the lens that I'm trying to construct, that I do take over in part from Nietzsche, but certainly I don't. I mean, what Nietzsche attuned me to, I would say, is the extent to which the pre-Socratic moral world is one shaped fundamentally by the poets, and therefore one in which a kind of moral aesthetic sensibility has a kind of is the character of kind of the moral outlook of average Athenians and average Greeks. I don't think I would go with Nietzsche the whole 9 yards in The Birth of Tragedy, even in his account of the central place that the institution of tragedy plays in shaping the pre-Socratic culture. I think it's kind of telling in a way that in the kind of the core of that argument, somewhere in sections 13, 14, and 15, he appeals to Aristophanes and to a comedy, Clouds, as kind of his most central piece of evidence. And I think the evidence is there, but I don't think it supports the idea that it's really the institution of tragedy, that the pre-Socratic culture was, as Nietzsche would have it, a distinctly tragic culture. It does, however, point to kind of the poetic aesthetic foundations of pre-Socratic morality, and the challenge in some sense that poses in any kind of exchange with Socrates.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dwight. Let's go to William.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor Allman, for your paper. My question concerns the theme of patriotism. The speech of the laws strikes me as very patriotic, and the way that you describe Crito as well, as someone controlled by a kind of civic piety, also strikes me as a patriotic description. So but this is not a theme that you mention explicitly in the paper, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts about the relationship between patriotism and the noble are. Specifically, is patriotism noble? Do you find it significant that Socrates, in a way, affirms Crito's patriotism? And would you say, perhaps, that or is there any way in which patriotism is kind of a halfway house between the kind of aesthetic morality you're speaking of and philosophy?
Yeah. Well, let me for a minute talk about one of the footnotes that I didn't complete that I think is important in making sense of this. This idiom that if you've spent any time with Plato, you bumped into. Frankly, if you've spent any time with the literature of the 5th century, you've come across it. The kalos kagathos. Strauss, I think, likes to translate it with the word gentleman. And I understand why. I think in our own place and moment in time, gentleman doesn't work as well, maybe as it once did. I think Strauss has very much in mind, kind of the high Victorian understanding of the gentleman. But quite literally, it means the noble / beautiful and good. And packed into that word kalos is, I think, something of one piece of evidence in favor of Nietzsche's contention that this pre-Socratic moral culture is very much rooted in, or is very much shaped by a poetic tradition, and very much understands and relates to the idea of what is noble by means of sensibilities and sensitivities that the poets have been responsible largely for shaping. So the question, in a sense, in this dialogue, it seems to me that guides the conversation is the question of what a genuinely good and noble, or noble and good man would do. And I think Socrates tries consistently to kind of link up the idea of the noble, which has, I'm arguing, originally kind of these aesthetic dimensions, with to link it up with the matter of the just, and what he succeeds in doing, it seems to me, in the dialogue is in bringing Crito round to understand or to agree with him that what's truly noble in this case is to stand with the laws, the just governance of the laws, and the just rule of law, and that places them in kind of on a common ground from which they can both agree to what is to be done, to the course of action that they should pursue. At the same time, so my point is that he appeals in the end to a certain kind of what I called civic piety that is available in Crito, and that links him to his concern for the noble, and he uses that to find this common ground. But that there's another there's another way in which one can view, another lens through which one can view Socrates' arguments. And I think what comes into view when one looks through that other lens is that Socrates, that the arguments don't, that he voices in the name of the laws, don't apply to him as fully and as completely as they might apply to Crito. But they do kind of point in the direction of a second understanding of what is truly noble here, and that is bound up with the way in which he has positioned himself in a sense to make a certain kind of defense of philosophizing, even at the expense of his life.
Great, thank you, Dwight. Larry?
So thank you, and nice to meet you, Dwight.
Meet you, Larry.
There are a few things that caught my eye, but I think what I'll do, maybe there are two I'll just maybe make into suggestions, and you can comment if you like or not, but one true question. First suggestion, I like your observation, just you bringing to our attention that Socrates' initial response to Crito, that to be otherwise would be to be out of tune, implying thereby that he's in tune. And you take that, or at least say that he's in tune with or in harmony with himself. And that sounds right to me, but I wonder whether there isn't more implied there as well, whether he isn't in tune with some greater principle, let's just say, or maybe that principle is something that's been realized in himself, but in that case, it's still maybe, you know, worth thinking about, whether it's not worth noticing, talking about. The other second suggestion near the end of the paper, I think you rightly suggest, and you're kind of subjecting the arguments of the nomoi to your own analysis, and especially thinking back to the apology, and you note that thinking of the apology gives us reason to contest the assertion made by the laws that they are the ones who provided, or to whom Socrates owes his nurture and education. Of course, Socrates also said, as you noted, that, you know, he had the laws say that he owed his birth or his existence to them as well. And I wonder whether that isn't also, you know, contestable, and maybe in a certain sense, for some readers, at least the most easily contestable. You know, what does Socrates owe Athens? He owes his being as an Athenian, as a citizen, right? Not his biological, or say, or maybe trans-political being. And given, you know, that he's speaking from something that seems trans-political, that also might be worth thinking about. The actual question goes to Critos, the source of Critos' resistance to Socrates, something I guess around 48a or so, and page 17 in your paper. So you observe that Crito has no answer to make to certain arguments that Socrates makes to him. Nevertheless, you know, he's not ready to give up the fight. And so you write, Crito does not apparently feel bound by arguments against which he can muster no reply. It is not logos which ultimately commands his allegiance. Well, I wouldn't want to argue that it is logos exactly that ultimately commands his allegiance, but it's not so clear that it doesn't either. I mean, and even if he's breaking with past practice, it's conceivable that he's breaking with past practice because in the past he's gone along with Socrates' alleged reasoning just as a matter of faith or authority, and that now, when the stakes are real, you know, it just seems unreasonable to him, you know, that Socrates should accept his sentence. And now, I guess in a strict sense, if he can't give a real argument, then maybe you could say, well, therefore it is not logos which commands his allegiance. But there are a lot of times, I think, when even thoughtful people among us, you know, will take a stand initially, even before they're able to articulate, you know, what the stand is all about. So, especially in light of your own suggestion that in the end, Socrates has other purposes, that there's something incomplete about these arguments, that they're not simply, you know, logical, or as they seem. So, you know, even that could suggest that Crito is not so far afield of logos after all.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is where one goes to, you know, kind of find some evidence of you know, what is Critos' position in what he says initially, and of course he begins the conversation, taking the lead, that is, in the conversation, and he speaks to Socrates pretty consistently in a kind of imperative voice. You know, heed my command and do as I say, seeming to want to, in some sense, circumvent the kind of characteristic back and forth that he knows is Socrates' Elenchic way, right? But what he seems to me to reveal, and here I think I agree with Strauss on this, is really a concern with his own circumstance, essentially. He's concerned about how he will be perceived in all of this, about the shame that may well attach to him as a wealthy man if Socrates goes forward with this plan, when it seems on Critos, based on what Crito says, that there's kind of a broad or a general expectation that, you know, somebody like Crito will fix things and Socrates will be able to slip out under cover of darkness and go and live in exile and escape, in effect, the explicit punishment of the city. So Socrates, you know, when he kind of chimes in for the first time, notes on the one hand that they've kind of talked about these things before. And he says something about the prothumia, the spirit of Critos' engagement, his spiritedness, as it were. But he suggests that it's worth much if it's connected up with kind of a right understanding of the right course of action. It's a problem if it's not, he says, in effect. And then he proposes that what they do is that they go through again and just see if the arguments, as at least Socrates represents them, that have kind of led him to this point and to certain conclusions and to kind of embrace the course that he's on, look different in the light, in this new light, the light of his imminent execution. And nothing that Socrates says, I think, subsequent to that suggests that his mind has been changed on anything. Crito doesn't give us any indication that he's disagreeing with Socrates. And Socrates even says, at one point pipes up and says, "Now, Crito, don't agree to this if you disagree with it. If you're not embracing this, you need to disagree with this, or you need to say so." And yet he comes to the end of this case for searching out the best logos, which he describes as kind of his approach to this kind of circumstance, his general approach. He suggests that it's always the best logos that he follows, which isn't to foreclose the possibility that a better logos could come along. But that's how he approaches this. He looks for the best logos, and they spend a good deal of time in this part of the conversation, kind of reviewing why certain opinions ought to rank higher than others. But they come to the end of it, and Socrates poses this question, this anonymous, or makes this comment on behalf of some anonymous observer about, but the many have the ability to kill us. Where does that come from? I guess I'm suggesting that it is a way by which Socrates tests exactly how much of what Crito has been agreeing to all the way along here in this part of the exchange he really embraces. And Crito, of course, immediately reveals that he doesn't really, he hasn't really been persuaded by any of it. And so I think at that point, Socrates changes course. I guess that's my argument, that there's a real change of course, and that course eventuates in the argument made in the voice of the laws, which does reach Crito in a way that the previous attempt to kind of bring him round to reaffirm conclusions that Socrates suggests they had kind of arrived at together previously didn't reach him. And I'm searching for something to latch onto in order to to make fuller sense of Crito's what Crito is really kind of fishing for, what Crito really means. Maybe you can help me.
Well, I would only suggest that I don't argue or think that Crito is agreeing that he's departing from what they previously agreed to, because they haven't previously been discussing. Well, I should say, what I think Crito could be disputing is that argument that is made by the laws. You could say, well, yeah, I do agree that we should not violate agreements we've entered into, especially against people, who have done, or beings that have done much for us. But do the laws qualify? Again, the argument can go by quickly, and Crito's not able to respond. But any one of us, not being on the spot and reading this thing and and teaching it, can see that there are, as you put it yourself, incomplete elements, and so I'm not trying to suggest that Crito is remotely philosophic or a profoundly rational person, but only that his impulses, instincts here may be something other than just the legacy or the doings of poet legislators, but just something that most people might well agree, even Socrates might agree, in the end, are reasonable, and that would be why Socrates has to put an end to the arguments, by, in a most profoundly sort of irrational way, by not claiming he couldn't hear anything more than these arguments that the laws are making.
Okay, well, it's certainly worth pondering. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Michael Hawley.
Thank you very much for the paper. My question is about this business of the common ground that you talked about both in the talk and that comes up at the end of the paper. And I was looking for you to explain a bit more in what sense it really is a common ground rather than Socrates just finding arguments that are going to work on Crito, but which he himself does not share. You say that the arguments on behalf of the laws that Socrates makes have some valence for him. But they do seem like fairly absolute arguments. And so it's not clear to me how those kinds of arguments can have a partial claim, but not a total claim on someone. You point to the Apology where Socrates gives good reasons why they might not have claim on him. You might also get out of the Republic where Socrates says, if a philosopher arises not through the help of the laws, he owes that city nothing. So what is it that is true for Socrates about the argument that he's giving from the laws? Even when he gives it to Crito in the Crito, it's framed as we should stick by our agreements if what we've agreed to is, if what's sort of being stipulated that we do is right. That seems awfully question begging about whether or not Socrates allowing himself to be killed is right. So yeah, what is it that is the partial valence or truth?
Well, it seems like there's two parts to your question. The first part of the question is the question of the common ground and what lies behind that. And here again, I think I'm guilty of having sketched out a footnote that's not complete in the paper that I sent out to everybody. But I think Socrates even makes rather clear in the argument, in one of the arguments at least, that he rehearses it again in the name of the laws, in the voice of the laws, that he is expecting that his friends, Crito among them, and maybe foremost among them, will play a key role in looking after his family, his immediate responsibility after he's gone. And in a way, this kind of returns also in the Phaedo. If you'll recall, if you know that dialogue, Socrates is in the company of his wife initially when Phaedo arrives, and he and a few other friends, I think, are led in together, and she grows weepy as she considers the fact that this is going to be his final meeting and conversation with his friends. And Socrates turns her over to Crito to kind of take charge of her and remove her from the scene. I take from that Socrates is hoping and expecting that Crito, as perhaps the most well-heeled of his friends, will play the key role in providing for his family after he's gone. So it's important on that very practical ground for Crito and Socrates to kind of see eye to eye in some sense about the course of action here. And I take that to be in the background of this whole dialogue. I guess what I would say to the second question is kind of what I tried to end with in my remarks. I think Socrates fully believes that there is a case to be made, especially to a man like Crito, that it's noble to give one's full support to, even place one's life on the line for the just rule of the laws, at least of the laws that he invokes here, so that that is a certain kind of partial sense in which he understands and accepts the arguments he's making on behalf of the laws. I think as I try to explain that there is this other understanding of things in which Socrates is directed not in the final analysis by a primary commitment to the laws of Athens, but by a primary commitment to the philosophical life and the possibilities and prospects for that life to continue to flourish in Athens, that is really kind of guiding the sacrifice he's willing to make here, and that's where he. I mean, that turns out to be the more important, the higher sense of the noble for him, even while he recognizes that it's maybe a bit of a reach or a bridge too far for Crito. So he offers Crito an argument for one kind of, or one level of nobility, maybe we could call it, even while at the end of, at the bottom of the whole thing, his is a different kind of commitment and rooted in a different priority.
Thank you, Dwight. Lee.
Hi, Dwight. Thank you for your paper. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Lee.
I guess my question is about what you think the dialogue tells us about the demos, because it seems to me that there's really the third character, the implicit character in the dialogue is the demos, and the characterizations we get of it are peculiar. I mean, Crito says that the people will think less of him if he doesn't try to free Socrates, which puts the demos in this position where they condemn Socrates and then fully expect people to try to help him evade justice. And then that also puts the demos in conflict with the laws, which appear later and tell Socrates, you can't do that. So
Yeah.
What do you think the dialogue is trying to tell us about what's going on with the demos?
Well, there is that kind of interesting exchange where the polloi, the many, are very much at the subject matter of what Crito and Socrates are talking about. Crito obviously takes his bearings to a certain degree from the many, and is concerned about their influence and their authority. And Socrates makes that remark about the fact that the demos, he wishes it were true that the many were capable of the greatest evil, because that would in turn mean that they were capable of the greatest good as well, and he doesn't see them as capable of either. So occupying a kind of, I think I described it as a kind of middling space, and if we extend that to the regime of the many, democracy, then it looks to be a kind of middling regime, incapable of really greatness or great evil. I do think in the background here, I'm not sure I've sorted all of this out to my satisfaction. In fact, I'm quite certain I haven't sorted this out to my complete satisfaction. But in the background is, recent events in Athens history, and the fact that Socrates had this historic relationship and connection to Critias, arguably the most important of the 30 tyrants. Both Plato and Xenophon give us some reason to believe that Anytus was really kind of the most important figure, even though Meletus takes the lead in making the prosecution's case. Anytus was the kind of the big cheese, the political person most involved in overturning the regime of the 30 and seemingly behind this attempt in some sense to rid the city of Socrates, who was seen as part of the problem that led to the 30. So kind of cleaning house, as it were. And I think all of that is very much in the background of the trial, and I think it's still in the background of the Crito. But I think it's also notable that Plato doesn't, he doesn't really take on the demos or take on the democracy directly. There's kind of this indirect way in which we get the impression that it's a regime in which philosophers like Socrates can find a space and can lead a philosophic life, but it's not a regime at the end of the day in which the greatest good really seems to be possible for the regime as a whole. I mean, I think that both the Apology and the Crito at the same time are animated by a certain kind of civic concern or civic project on Plato's part. That this is where Plato is really trying to, on the one hand, make a certain kind of apology for Socrates in order to secure the future of democracy. I mean, sorry, a philosophy in Athenian democracy, and yet at the same time, acknowledges in various ways that there are limits to how far one can go from his vantage point in embracing and affirming this regime.
Twice. Thank you. Jeff.
Hey, Dwight. Thanks for the paper. So my question has to do with, I guess, the character of Crito himself and his significance or role in the political theory of Plato and Socrates. I mean, he's an interesting character, right? Because he's a rich guy, and he entrusts his son to Socrates to be taught. We learn in the Euthydemus, there's the framing discussion between Socrates and Critobulus. So at least there's a way in which, Crito recognizes the value of the philosophical life, so that there may be some suggestion that there's a way to bridge a gap between the philosopher and the city, at least in the character of Crito. And I like the way that you framed the paper in terms of, I don't know, like the ethical life of 5th century Athens and its commitment to this kalos kagathos. I mean, I would guess another way to to focus my question here and thinking about the significance of this character is, well, what is Socrates' role here vis-a-vis the ethical life of Kalos? Is he a reformer in your view? That is, he wants to transform the understanding of the Greek ethical life in a more philosophical direction, so to bridge it that way, or he's not a reformer. I mean, he wants to sort of maintain that gap between the philosopher and the city. And so that accounts for this distinction, I guess, that you draw between the Apology and the Crito. I mean, I'm struck by your point about the esoteric defense as presented in the Apology, which is super public, whereas the exoteric view is presented by Crito and the Crito, which is super private, just between two people. Anyway, that was maybe several questions, but what do you think?
Well, I thanks for this question, because it does maybe kind of circle back to Lee's question as well, and maybe give me a second shot at saying something about that, because I guess I do incline to the view that Plato is doing some civic work in a number of his dialogues, and these two in particular. So these two dialogues, don't have big philosophical questions at their center, especially the Crito. It's a very practical question. But and maybe I probably need to make this more explicit. I mean, I appreciate your question in that regard too. I do think that Plato throughout his corpus, and I think we see evidence of this also in Xenophon, gives us a Socrates who is trying to, as it were, rethink the question of the noble and the good, and in particular in this very important social moral construct of kalos kagathos, and recast that morality. And I guess this is a way in which also I find myself influenced by Nietzsche, at least to an extent. I think that the Socratic engagement of the question of the noble, gives us oftentimes it seems to Socrates wants to move in a direction that is very functionalist, and he does that at the beginning of the Apology in a way when he explains to the judges, what their job is, what their task is, and calls that noble. And Xenophon has him doing this all over the place in the Memorabilia. So I think he is kind of engaged in a quarrel with the poets here. The legacy of the poets is this what I've described, I guess, as moral or aesthetic morality of a sort. And Socrates is engaging that, finding it in various ways deficient, and trying to make it more efficient or better by that engagement. And that's, at least in part, what's going on with Crito in this dialogue.
Okay, well, thank you, Dwight. Michael Zuckert.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Dwight, hi, thank you for the
Hi,
paper.
Michael.
Nice to see you after, it seems like a long time since
Yeah.
last I saw you. So I had a question, actually, a somewhat textual question. I wonder whether you find any significance in the fact that at the trial, Socrates had already, in a very definitive way, rejected what Crito wants him to do. That is, he was offered exile. He was offered Thessaly as a possible place to go, where Phthia happens to be found. And he's already definitively rejected it in a way that Crito has publicly heard. Now, is there anything we should make of that? Is it possible that Crito knows that this is, is it possible that Crito knows that there's no chance Socrates is going to be persuaded by anything he says, and that his agenda in this discussion is not the agenda that it seems to be? Not, whatever it might be.
Well, I certainly think that one could, I agree with what you said about the Apology fully. I think you could and probably should understand that as kind of part of the backdrop of this conversation. In that respect, I think it's quite notable that Crito doesn't really want to have a conversation about this. He simply wants to command Socrates to do what he's got in mind, and he's obviously gone to some pains, as we learn, to set this up, right? I mean, he's bribed the guards and made it possible for him to easily come and go, but also, of course, for him ultimately to leave with Socrates in tow. And he's got it all set up in that respect. I'm not sure where to go beyond that with whatever it is Crito has in mind. I mean, I think Crito reveals himself, as I've already indicated in the beginning of the dialogue, to be concerned about his own reputation to an important extent. Even while he seems to be certainly prepared, and in the end, I think that proves to be a very important matter for Socrates to take care of Socrates' own family. As I try to point out in the paper, Socrates he talks about kind of two reasons why this is a bad idea. On the one hand, he would lose this invaluable companion that he has no hope of ever replacing. And on the other hand, of course, there's his family to look after, right? The first one is kind of problematic because what he seems to have in mind is Socrates goes and lives in exile, and therefore he's not around. And Socrates touches on this before he's finished when in the Voice of the Laws, he talks about his family. And I continue, as I've said, I really think that an important part of the backdrop here is Socrates needing Crito to take care of certain practical commitments he has, first and foremost his family, and that's why this practical necessity of reaching some kind of common ground, some basis for agreeing on the course forward is so important. I mean, maybe you want to offer us some insight into what you think maybe is the alternative agendas that Crito has?
Well, what I would offer not so much an insight, but rather another question, which is, how do we know about this conversation between Socrates and Crito?
Yeah, of course we don't, right? It's private, and unlike so many, I mean, in the Phaedo, of course, Plato makes clear he wasn't present, but he at the same time gives us some history of the transmission of this conversation.
Right.
And of course, in the Apology, he paints himself right into the picture, so we know he was there, even though I think there's reason to believe that what we get by way of his report on the trial is not exactly true to the event. Certainly, there are tensions between what he reports and what Xenophon reports. So I don't know. I mean, I agree. I don't think there's any basis on which we can have any degree of confidence this is a real conversation.
Would it make sense, though, to speculate that the source of knowledge of this conversation is Crito?
That he had
who benefits from passing it on?
Yeah. So you see Crito relaying this to Plato, even though it's not a particularly.
Yeah. I mean, literarily, I'm not. I don't want to make any claims about the actual historicity of this conversation, but I mean, literarily, we are to understand what that was.
Well, I mean, who else could it come from? I'm not sure, but at the same time,
right.
It's kind of funny that Plato chooses not to say anything about its origins, as if it came out of thin air.
True. He wants us to figure it out.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So Michael Tang.
Hi. So I guess my question was about what you said at the end of your summary, where you suggested that Socrates' argument from the perspective of the laws to Crito is sort of an exoteric justification of dying. So the argument would be that he's dying for the city. But in fact, your suggestion was that the esoteric account of his death was that he was sacrificing himself for philosophy. And I wondered if you could say more about that justification. Because I guess on the one hand, I could easily imagine Socrates using that same argument from the perspective of the laws and replacing the city with philosophy. And then maybe one could argue that he's indebted to philosophy or the community of philosophers in such a way that it would justify dying. But then I also wonder if perhaps that's still very much related to the kind of moral aesthetic tradition that you talk about. And maybe Socrates reasons about his sacrifice in a completely different way. I guess I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think to begin with, I accept Xenophon's rather explicit statement or revelation that Socrates went into the trial with the intention of, losing, as it were, being found guilty and being sentenced to death. We don't get that explicitly from Plato, certainly not as explicitly as we get it from Xenophon. And Xenophon makes clear that this is kind of his reason for writing up his account. I mean, we have good reason to believe that there were a number of accounts written. Some people, I think, have even kind of argued or at least speculated that maybe Socrates didn't say anything in his trial and left it wide open for others to supply kind of his defense speech. I'm not really in that camp, but Xenophon makes quite clear that his reason for writing this up, and he wasn't there, right? He was off on campaign. So he's getting this secondhand from somebody who was there, a friend of his, and somebody who, like Xenophon himself, was part of Socrates' circle. but he makes clear that he wants to explain the problem, as he represents it, of Socrates' megalegoria, his boastful speech, or his big speech, his big talking, that apparently some had said, if he'd just been a little more humble or deferential, he wouldn't have ended up with the death penalty. His chronicle is an attempt to set the record straight, that he started off with that intention and directed it exactly as he intended. I think we see some verification of this in, as I said earlier, kind of that middle speech he delivers in Plato's Apology, when he goes out of his way, having been found guilty by what seems genuinely to surprise him, a relatively small number of votes. He then goes out of his way to ensure that he offends, many more, and that at least in terms of a concrete proposal that he himself generates, there's not really a serious alternative to the penalty that has been proposed by the prosecution. So I think we get Plato's representation of that megalegoria in that, especially in that kind of center part of Plato's Apology, of the Apology. In any event, I think the evidence as a whole really does suggest that Socrates, maybe had a variety of thoughts, including the fact that his days of leading the only life worth living, as he represents it in the Apology, were numbered. He was 70 years old by the time the trial took place. But I also think that there's a reason to see this, and especially what Plato does with it, as a certain kind of representation of a noble Socrates, who is ultimately putting his life on the line for the future of philosophy within the purview of this regime. And whatever you want to say, here we come back to Lee's question again, whatever you want to say about Athenian democracy, it was the only place that philosophy really flourished in Socrates' days. And it seems to me one might also add that really, in some sense, the heyday of philosophy was in the next century, right? Socrates is put to death, but it's really in the 4th century, not the 5th century, that Plato founds the Academy. The Stoics set up their shop. All sorts of different philosophical schools kind of take root in Athens, eventually Aristotle's as well. So Athens becomes kind of the center, certainly culturally and intellectually, of the Mediterranean world in the next century, even as her political significance persistently declines. And one might, I'm not sure how tight an argument it would be, but one might attempt an argument that links this up with what Socrates did, and what Plato in particular then kind of made of that event in 399.
Okay, thank you, Dwight. Michael G just doesn't have a question. I'll go to Ivy, I think has a question.
Hello, thank you for the paper. So as I understand it, you're presenting a concept of the noble as the heroic noble, the self-sacrificial noble. And I'm curious about that in reference to the trial, because if we take Plato seriously, that Socrates needs people to philosophize, he needs customary opinion to philosophize. And we also know that in banishment, he wouldn't have the same people or people at all with whom to philosophize. And we also know his days are numbered. And if we take him seriously, that he could not live without philosophy, or that he doesn't know the nature of death, or if in fact it's worse than life or better than life. How can we call his death a true sacrifice? Well,
I mean, I guess it depends in part on how you want to define the word true here. I mean, it's his death is, after all, at the hands of the city of Athens. I've already said that I think that Socrates may well have had multiple motives or multiple things kind of going on in his head as he contemplated this circumstance. One of them being that he was getting a little long in the tooth, and his days of leading the only life worth living were numbered. But I think Plato, at least, is eager to represent him in a kind of heroic light. I think Plato's portrait of Socrates in these two dialogues in particular is his most heroic portrait of his mentor. And I think that's bound up with what I've described earlier as kind of the civic dimensions of these dialogues. And that links to, on the one hand, what I would call Socrates' exoteric teaching to Crito is about the importance of supporting and going to bat for, even putting your life perhaps on the line for the just rule of the laws, but also the esoteric dimension, I think, that is present in both of these dialogues of Socrates having come to a certain juncture in his life, deciding that maybe the best thing he could do for philosophy going forward would be to let these Democrats, and they are all Democrats who kind of lined up in some sense as his prosecutors, take his life and let Plato and others use that as a way of safeguarding the practice of philosophy for the generations that come behind him. And it seems to me one could at least point to what happens, as I just was doing, in the 4th century as evidence of that kind of thing actually succeeding in this case.
I think another way to ask this question is this. Do you see this portrayal of Socrates as a hero as a genuine belief that Plato holds, or rather a rhetorical technique to improve the reputation of philosophy?
Well, no, I think, I guess I incline to the former. I think Plato held Socrates in very high esteem. I think he believed that he made a real sacrifice, even if there's a sense in which, he wouldn't have lived another 40 years, and he certainly wouldn't have lived 40 years and been able to continue as leading the life he'd led. But I think he greatly admired Socrates. I also kind of think that he understood that it kind of fell to him in particular to make sure that what Socrates did had the effect, the immunizing effect, I think, that Socrates was seeking for those friends of his and others following behind who would be leading lives of philosophizing.
Well, thank you, Dwight. Now we're coming close to the end. Is there another question? Well, if not, I want to thank you, Dwight, for your very insightful paper and for this very insightful discussion of your paper. And I just want to know if Jeff wanted to announce what the next one was going to be. I forgot to do that at the beginning.